Excellent. So thanks ever so much for joining, everybody, and big thanks to Jonny, who's our speaker today. Week 4 of Great Wall Group Winter Online course, and this time we're going to be led through some of the intervention of the other allies in Italy, and I'm sure that's going to be a really interesting exploration and discussion afterwards. So just to give Jonny a little bit of introduction, a little bio. So Jonny's been travelling to Great War battlefields for over 20 years. He's gained an MA in Great Britain in the First World War from Wolverhampton, as I know lots of other Great War Group members have. And he's taken that further because he's currently studying for a PhD on the development of 6 particular BEF divisions on the Western Front, 1917 and 1918. So I think fair to say Jonny really knows this stuff, both as a battlefield visitor, but also now as an academic. But today, as I say, the topic is going to be on Allied intervention in Italy. And with that, I will hand over to you, Jonny.
Lovely. Thanks, Henry. Much appreciated. And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for logging on and listening to me have a bit of a ramble about, but it's more of a side interest in terms of the Great War is the Italian theatre. Chantilly, Caporetto and the Cesuna switch, Allied intervention in Italy in 1917 and 1918. As ever, when preparing these things, it comes across that it's a fairly broad subject which butts up against a lot of what's already been said, and I suspect what Nicola will be saying next week. But I hope it will give you a decent overview of the subject and lead you to sort of dig down a few more rabbit holes in true Great War Group style. That's me, as Henry's mentioned. As I say, I've had a fairly long-standing side interest in the Italian front. I first went to Asiago about 10 years ago. Trenches up mountains, Aperol Spritz at €2.50 a glass, and excellent pizzas. There's very little that's not to like about the Italian front. So that's me. I'm going to briefly, we can talk about this at the end. I'm going to briefly just touch on the historiography and what's been written so far. Obviously, the Italian front has nothing like the kind of level of coverage that the Western Front has, as you would expect. James Emmons' official history is as comprehensive as you would imagine. And there's just been a sort of an increase in the level of interest in the campaign over the last few years. I'm just going to pick out 2 titles, and we can talk about more at the end. I'd say if you're looking for something about the British intervention in Italy, John Dillon's Allies Are a Tiresome Lot, which I believe is his PhD thesis turned into a book, is probably the most comprehensive look at the British involvement in the campaign. George Cassar's The Forgotten Front. It's now sadly out of print, and it'll cost you a few quid to pick a copy up. But it's worth searching out if you can. There's always room for improvement. One of the things I've really not found is any English language works about the French part in the campaign, which is probably not surprising. I'd love to know if there's stuff out there, or if there are French language works out there. We can have a go. I can have a go at translating with my pidgin French. And yeah, obviously happy to have a chat about what's available out there at the end. So just a little bit of background to Italy and the Great War, which you may well have already covered on some of the earlier talks. Italy's linked to Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire by the Triple Alliance of 1882, which gets kind of periodically renewed up to about 1912, before expiring in 1915. Broadly, Italy wants to complete what's called the Risorgimento, which is the unification of the Kingdom of Italy in 1861. There's various Italian-speaking areas of the Austro-Hungarian Empire which the Italians are keen to bring into the kingdom. They actually remain neutral at the outbreak of war based on a couple of technicalities. It was a defensive pact, and the Austro-Hungarians are quite clearly the aggressor. And they don't actually consult the Italians before declaring war on Serbia, which is part of the treaty. So they kind of sit back and kind of keep their powder dry. It's a reasonably popular decision at home, as far as I can gather. There's a sizable nationalist movement, including the likes of Benito Mussolini, who want intervention on the side of the Austro-Hungarians. the politicians play a fairly sort of diplomatic game with both sides. This is, as I said, this is broadly about territory. The Prime Minister, I think at the time, is Antonio Salandra, and the Foreign Minister, Sidney Sonino. They kind of basically play both sides off against each other in secret without much knowledge of Parliament. And they eventually join the side of the Allies. They signed the Treaty of London on the 26th of April 1915, declare war on Austria-Hungary on the 23rd of May, and then eventually Germany on the 28th of August. In terms of the Italian front, I mean, how prepared the Italian army are, they have the numbers, but they're kind of fairly ill prepared for war. They're short on kind of your key material for modern warfare, so machine guns, heavy artillery. The politicians kind of view see a brief and limited war ahead, and don't really see a great deal of need to mobilise the nation's resources, which I'm sure keen students of the Great War will probably find that quite a familiar notion. As again, I'm sure has probably been mentioned, the vast majority of the 400-mile frontier between Austria and Italy is largely guarded by mountains, so the strategic and tactical options for either side to invade are relatively limited. I'm going to start by a look at the Chantilly conferences. There's actually three. It's the first two that concern us, which take place in July and December 1915. It's really about the Allies agreeing a strategy for prosecuting the war. That picture is slightly blurred, but that's Joseph Joffre looking reasonably purposeful at the 1915 conference. So we start off. The first one takes place at Grand Quartier General, and I apologise for my butchery of the French language there, at Chantilly on the 7th of July 1915. And it's the first inter-Allied conference of the war, and there are representatives from France, Great Britain, Belgium, Italy, Serbia, and Russia. Realistically, not a huge amount is achieved. The British are represented by Sir John French, who I think has probably only got about another sort of 6 months or so in the job at that time, and Willie Robertson, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff. Broadly, there's an agreement to sort of carry on assisting the French, but Kitchener, who's Secretary of State for War at that point, has really requested that we don't undertake any major offensives until there's enough both trained manpower, artillery, and weaponry on the front. There's kind of a lack of experience on fighting with allies on all sides, and there's a certain amount of kind of distrust and tension about what the motives are post-war. I think Joffre makes he's commander-in-chief of the French army at that point. He makes, I think, what is the key point is that the key to success for the Allies is to coordinate their offensive efforts. And that's broadly what happens at the first conference. So we kind of fast forward to the December conference, a little more purposeful. And I think Allied minds have been broadly focused by, let's list the battles: Third Artois, Loos, and I think there's probably been about 4 Isonzo battles since then. So I think it's kind of focused the minds a little. And there's a broad agreement on coordinated strategy across multiple fronts to basically drain the enemy's resources, pin down reserves, that kind of thing. It's aimed for sort of kind of May, June 1916. The Italians sort of kick off their part with the 5th Battle of the Isonzo in March, from March 9th to the 15th. It's relatively, I'm sure you're reasonably familiar with the battles of the Isonzo. It's relatively predictable results. There's not really much by way of gains for either side. I think 4,000 casualties, which is probably one of the smaller Isonzos. But I think the key point there is that actually a couple of weeks before the Germans attacked Verdun, which obviously throws things into sort of a certain degree of disarray in terms of how the Battle of the Somme pans out and how 1916 goes in general. A kind of a key part of this is the relationship between the politicians and the generals, which is obviously a theme that runs throughout the Great War. But I think Italy is one of those things that kind of brings it to a bit more of a head. Obviously, there's David Lloyd George on the right, and Haig on the left. Sorry, and Haig on the right. I think if we look at 1916 in context, you have from the Allied perspective, sorry. You have Verdun, the Somme, the Brusilov offensive, and more battles of the Isonzo. I think the Allies have probably racked up something in the region of about 2.5 million casualties, killed or wounded during that year. We move on to 1917, obviously the failure of the Nivelle offensive and where that leaves the French army in terms of needing to regroup. Lloyd George looks at what's happened in 1916, and he's really very, very keen on not renewing the Western Front, and just trying to sort of seek alternatives. He's looking at Haig's plans for a sort of a breakout attack in Flanders and onto the Belgian coast, noting that there's probably going to be a limited or lack of any French assistance, which he just thinks it's looking like more heavy casualties for limited gain on the Western Front. He has one of his preferences to send Luigi Cadorna, who's the chief of staff of the Italian army, guns so that he can conduct a defensive on Trieste. And his take is really that he thinks that the Austro-Hungarians would succumb to a far heavier barrage of the kind that you've seen on the Western Front than they'd experienced previously. And it kind of ignores the harsh realities of war. His belief is that this will probably send the Australians to the table to negotiate. It might do likewise to Bulgaria and Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire, rather. It's going to potentially free up Russian and Italian troops to join the other allies and encircle the German army. And this is all sounding terribly ideal, but as I say, it really ignores the harsh realities of war. It underplays the amount of aid that the Germans could potentially send. The difficulties of waging war on this front, which we'll see more about. You're dealing with an enemy entrenched in the mountains, which certainly the British and Commonwealth troops have very, very limited experience of. The transport between France and Italy is not perfect. And it's just this uncritical belief that it's going to be enough to induce the Austrians to end the war. Now, Willie Robertson and Haig have kind of rebutted this argument. And despite everything that's gone before, I think conditions on the Western Front still probably favour Haig, who himself believes that there's no way you're going to be achieved that much on the Isonzo front or the Italian front without considerable Allied resources. The other point is the elephant in the room is the Cadorna question. There's serious questions over his competence, and the notion of leaving the main war effort in his hands, I think, is pretty unpalatable to most people. What the Allies do in the first instance is actually sending some guns, because the Italian army really lacks heavy artillery. April 1917. This is while the Battle of Battle of Arras is going on. The British sent 10 batteries of 6-inch howitzers. Now, I think at the time there's only about 150 batteries on the Western Front, so it's not an inconsiderable amount. More follow in the summer. Cadorna actually makes a request for further guns, I think in July. And there's also there's reconnaissance going on in terms of transport routes to Italy. So there's a definite sort of shift to kind of certainly preparing the way for some kind of intervention should it become necessary. I'm just going to talk a little bit about this chap, Charles Delmé Radcliffe. He's attached to Comando Supremo, which is the Italian GHQ, and he's broadly the liaison between Britain and Italy. I'm just going to mention, because I think he's really quite an interesting guy. Like many British Army figures of the Great War, takes part in the Sudan campaign, and he goes off after the Sudan campaign and actually maps a few chunks of the Nile that have not previously been touched upon. 1906, he becomes Britain's military attaché to Rome, and he becomes quite ensconced with the Italian politicians of the day, the Italian royal family. And he's just sort of kind of the man on the spot of a few interesting things. He goes down and observes the eruption of Vesuvius in April 1906, and the aftermath of the Messina earthquake, I think in December 1908, which I think kills upwards of sort of 70,000 people. He coordinates the Red Cross efforts in Greece during the First Balkan War, and then kind of goes into sort of semi-retirement. But come the outbreak of the Great War, he's sort of the obvious choice for our man in Italy. There's no biography of him, but for me, he's a man who has a seems to have a very interesting life. He's ripe for a decent biography. So if anyone out there is short of a rabbit hole or a project to take on, then I'd recommend him. He's certainly worth a look. We will pop a picture of Cadorna in there, just because he is obviously relevant. Obviously, chief of staff to the Italian army from 1914 to 1917. I think looking rather like Parker from Thunderbirds there, but that's obviously just my opinion. We move on to Caporetto. This is the subject of Jim's talk a couple of weeks ago. This is really kind of a pivotal point in Italy's war, and in particular its relationship with its allies. Again, I'm going to butcher some pronunciations. That's an Austro-Hungarian artillery position on Monticello. I think it is Cello, not entirely sure. Looking over the Bovec Valley, where they actually launched a gas attack from. A very rewarding place to go. I climbed up there with Andrew Holmes, who many of you know, a few years back. I've never sweated so much in my entire life. It's an incredible spot to go to, but it takes a good deal of effort. So Caporetto, it takes London by surprise, I think, in terms of the War Office and the politicians. Jonny Radcliffe has said with reasonable confidence that he thinks the Italian army would meet the challenge of what they know seems to be an offensive coming. Cadorna himself sends a telegram to the War Office on the 21st of October, saying, I don't think we're going to have any difficulty repelling an attack when it comes. Neither of them are unduly alarmed by initial reports of the battle. I think by Caporetto sort of starts on the 24th. By the 26th, Cadorna is sort of implying but not requesting he might be able to do with a contingent of British and French troops, who could be quite welcome. Even when you get to the 27th, where reports are, I think they're described as disquieting, that the withdrawal is proceeding, but it's all happening in good order, and Cadorna is sort of broadly in control of the situation. Willie Robertson sends Jonny Radcliffe a telegram on the 27th of noon. It's one of the most fantastically patronising bits of Brit talking to foreigner I've ever seen. It says, you need to steady Commando Supremo, and the exact quote I picked out because I think it's fantastic. It's not a matter of help being needed so much as more courage and less panic on the part of the Italians. We'll leave that there. Realistically, the sort of bad news from Italy couldn't really come at a worse time. The French haven't really fully recovered from the Nivelle offensive, either politically or militarily. The British campaign at Third Ypres is starting to stall in the mud, and casualties are mounting. The Russians at this point are pretty much effectively out of the war. It's really not starting to smell terribly good for the Allies. So Maurice Hankey, who is Secretary of the Imperial War Cabinet, goes off to see Lloyd George, who is playing golf down at Warton Heath in Surrey. Sort of briefs of all the situation. Lloyd George is a particularly happy man. Apparently, he's had a bad round of golf, which for anyone who plays golf, that seems to be a thing that it does rather affect your mood. And he's sort of broadly, he recalls that he's called for intervention on the Italian front, exactly where the Central Powers have struck, and kind of been sort of batted away by the General Staff, who said, no, Western Front is absolutely where it's at. So he directs Robertson, so you have to formally offer assistance to Cadorna, which I think the French have actually done by that point. Robertson goes to Haig and says, you need to send 2 first-rate divisions and a good man, and ideally we'd like you to get there before the French arrive. So I think at this point, the relationship between Lloyd George and Haig, I can't remember where I picked that quote from, but it's pretty much at boiling point. The good man is Rudolph Lambert, who's the 10th Earl of Cavan. So he is commander of 14 Corps, which is 23rd and 41st Divisions, which are the 2 divisions that are selected. He's broadly been told, and Haig has been told, it's key that Italy doesn't collapse. And Haig's basically been warned, you need to make contingency for potentially another 4 divisions and some heavy artillery. We'll take a quick look at Cavan, because I think he's, again, another quite an interesting character. Commissioned into the Grenadier Guards in 1885, and he serves in the Second South African War as a company commander. Has a fairly sort of decent army career and retires in November 1913, I think, as a colonel. But obviously, a few months later, he's called back into action. His Great War record is really quite considerable. He serves as a brigade, division, corps, and army commander with no small degree of distinction. He commands the 4th Guards Brigade at 1st Epe. Promoted to Major General in June 15 and commands 50th Northumbrian Division for, I think, only about 6 weeks. Moves fairly swiftly to become General Officer commanding the Guards Division. Ends up as a Corps Commander in January 16, as Commander of 14 Corps. Commands it on the Battle of the Somme. And in October 1918, as we'll see sort of later in the presentation, he commands the 10th Anglo-Italian Army at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. So again, I think there is a biography floating about, but a really interesting character who's worth checking out. Rapallo and the Supreme War Council. This again, I think, is sort of another quite key shift in Allied strategy. I've picked these 2 pictures just because I think they're quite interesting. On the right is the hotel at Rapallo, where a key meeting that I'm going to talk about takes place. The other side is a copy of the Sunday Pictorial from Sunday, the 11th of November, 1917. Now, as well as announcing that the Allies have agreed to sort of have a kind of a single war command, there's also news of a Miss Lila McCarthy, who's an actress. There's news of her divorce from an actor, writer, and director named Harley Granville Barker. And it proves that our fascination for celebrity gossip and the marriages and lives of famous people is not exactly a new thing. So coming to Italy's aid now, David Lloyd George is in quite a good position at this point. As I've mentioned, he's kind of predicted, he's warned about this. We could bolster Italy here, or we could make an attack here. Renewing Flanders is just going to end up in another stalemate. So he's kind of sitting there thinking, told you so. 31st of October 1917, obviously it's a week into Caporetto, and it's quite clear that things have gone quite dramatically wrong for the Italian army. He meets Paul Painlevé, I think, during his first sort of brief spell as French Prime Minister. And Philippe Pétain, who's Commander-in-Chief of the French Army at that point. He meets him in London, and they discuss aid to Italy. And there's also kind of a broad agreement that there should be some form of inter-Allied war council, which is what becomes the Supreme War Council. It doesn't particularly go into details. And they agree to hold a conference at Rapallo, which is on the Italian Riviera near Genoa. By this point, it is obviously quite clear that Cadorna has lost control of the situation. The Italian army is going to drop back to the River Piave. The next line along from there, if they go any further back, I think is the River Mincio. Again, apologies for the pronunciation if that's wrong, but that's going to be a much longer front, and it's probably going to need somewhere between 20 or 30 Anglo-French divisions, which at that point is unthinkable. The only real sensible option is to abandon Italy to its fate at that point. So they're obviously very keen that this doesn't happen. Robertson is not happy at the idea of a Supreme War Council, but Hankey basically says to him, look, don't resist this because it's futile. The war cabinet's in agreement, the PM's behind it. At the conference itself, there's kind of a broad agreement that the Italian army is sort of kind of capable of holding its own at the River Piave if it's directed properly. Lloyd George is kind of not keen on pouring more troops into Italy unless there's some sort of assurance about more efficient leadership. Painlevé is broadly of the same mind. So the upshot of this is we'll support you, but the condition is broadly that Cadorna needs to go. I think at that point, Cadorna doesn't really have any particular fans in the Italian government. And the agreement is basically he shifted upstairs and becomes Italy's representative on the Supreme War Council, which is basically Foch, Henry Wilson from Britain, Cadorna, and then the following month, Tasker Bliss from the USA. It's based at Versailles. So Cadorna's removal is confirmed. He's replaced by a chap called Armando Diaz as new chief of staff at Comando Supremo. The Central Powers basically, they continue to push the Italian army at the Piave River, but they're pretty much exhausted by this point. Their supply lines are overstretched, and the Italians have actually got themselves a reasonably good defensive position. They're kind of holding firm. So in terms of morale, the news that there's going to be British and French reinforcements is certainly a help to Diaz and the Italian army, but actually militarily, their recovery and the resistance they put up at the Piave is a pretty decent achievement given what they've been through. The Allies arrive. Just a little bit on that picture. The slightly blurry one on the left is some French troops on the Asiago Plateau. And then the picture on the right is 48th Division. I think somewhere in the middle there is Cavan addressing them. So Cavan said, Robertson tells him that basically you need to put new heart into the Italians. Things are moving fairly swiftly at that point. On the 7th of November, Robertson says to Haig, you need to send 2 more divisions. Haig picks 7th and 48th South Midland divisions. And he's warned again that, the War Cabinet view this as pretty much as a top priority, and you may need to send another 4 divisions, but we'll let you know. Just to add grist to Haig's mill, the War Cabinet specifically choose Herbert Plumer to command the Italian Expeditionary Force, which displeases Haig enormously. And he writes in his diary, was there ever an army commander and his staff sent to another theatre of war in the middle of a battle? So obviously this is kind of towards the end of Third Ypres. Plumer, it has to be said, is equally unimpressed. He writes to his wife that day on the 7th of November, saying, I've just received a great shock. I've been ordered to go to Italy and assume command of the British forces there. I'm very sick about it and do not want to go in the least. And he expresses further similar sentiments the following day. I simply loathe leaving Second Army and feel very depressed. Not a popular decision all round, really. What Plumer does get, he gets his pick of staff officers. So he takes Tim Harrington with him, his much trusted staff officer. They arrive in Italy on the 13th of November. Cavan goes back to command 14 Corps. And Plumer just starts meeting with his opposite numbers in the French army, which is a chap called Denis Auguste Duchesne and Diaz. And they just take a look at the situation. And I think where they arrive at, I think it was 65 Italian divisions available before Caporetto, and there's now only 33 that are really considered combat ready. The Italians have lost, I think, several thousand guns and an awful lot of materiel in the retreat from Caporetto. All their available men, all goes into sort of kind of bringing the Western Front knowledge. They're all kind of broadly sort of stuck in the front line, so any breach really leaves them quite vulnerable. But ultimately, GHQ, Haig, Robertson are really rather concerned that this is sort of potentially starting to hand the initiative to Germany on the Western Front, which is really what they don't want. A quick look at the French. As I say, there's not a huge amount of information available. I'm not an expert on the French army. There's not a huge amount of information available. This is broadly what the French sent. It's 10th Army, commanded by Duchesne, as I mentioned. 31st Army Corps, supported by 64th and 65th Infantry Division, and 46th and 47th Alpine Infantry Divisions. They're quite key in the sense they've actually got some kind of experience in fighting on higher ground, which obviously the British don't have. 17 artillery groups, including 6 mountain regiments, and they sent another army corps a bit later in 1917. Again, my knowledge of the French army not perfect. I think that's something around about 100,000 fighting strength, there or thereabouts. We will mention the Americans at this point. They don't actually arrive until a little bit later, in kind of, sort of July 18. They send the 332nd Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel William Wallace, which is detached from the 83rd Division. June 18, they're heading from Liverpool down to Southampton, then on to France. They get diverted at the request of the Italians. They also bring 30 ambulance sections, a base hospital, and some pilots with them as well, who fly with the Italian Air Force. No mention of the Americans in Italy during the First World War is complete without a reference to Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, which he wrote in 1929, I think it was, based on his experience as an ambulance driver on the front, where I think he was quite badly injured. So, being very well educated folk, I'm sure you have read that already. So what do the Allies actually bring? The British and French both have a considerable amount of credibility with Diaz. He particularly likes Plumer. He's a sort of keen student of of war and all things military, and he's impressed with what Plumer did at Messines, and they bring battle-hardened troops with them, guys who've been fought on the Somme and on Passchendaele. They bring Western Front knowledge and tactics, which is something that is really quite lacking in the Italian army. It's a bit of a morale boost for the Italian forces. They've been through the mill a bit over the last 6 months or so. So some new blood is reasonably welcome. And it's just it's something else for the Austro-Hungarian army to think about. So a kind of a subplot to this is the relations between Plumer and Willie Robertson as chief of the Imperial General Staff while all this is going on. Cambrai obviously happens in the attack at Cambrai happens in November, and it obviously is initially successful. So Robertson is obviously kind of keen to sort of keep the tempo going. Plumer then really offends him by saying, actually, I could probably do with some couple more divisions if that can be done. And Robertson is kind of concerned that Plumer might be trying to open up more of a campaign in Italy, and in the knowledge that they will be fully supported by Lord George and probably the War Cabinet. The correspondence between them, I think, is probably best described as a bit terse. Following Plumer's request, Robertson writes to him, and it starts, which I think this is probably sort of considered rude by the standards of the time. I am sorry it has been found necessary for you to ask us for as many as 6 divisions. What the upshot of this is we end up with one more British division being sent out to the Italian front. They get 5th and 21st divisions ready, and they're told to prepare for departure. The latter is, I think, substituted for 6th Division, and both 6th and 21st are held back because of the German counterattacks at Cambrai. 5th Division go, and obviously Robertson is his key concern. We basically need to be killing Germans in France. That's kind of our main aim. So he's really not keen on losing any more resources to Italy. So the makeup of the British contingent out on the Italian front are the following: 5th Division under Major General Reginald Stevens, 7th Division under Major General Herbert Shoebridge, 23rd Division under Major General James Babington, 41st Division under Major General Sidney Lawford, and lastly 48th South Midland Division under Major General Robert Fanshawe. This slide is not a mistake. It hasn't sort of crept in from somewhere else. It's just a rabbit hole that I found while looking at the divisional commanders. How does Sergeant Pepper get in here? If you look inside, I'll leave you to do that. Obviously, we all know the front cover of Sergeant Pepper, but if you look inside the album artwork of Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, you will see a picture of Sergeant Pepper himself. It's actually Major James Babington, who's General Officer commanding the 23rd Division. You can dig around on the internet. That seems to be true, and not one of those strange rumours you see. The chap on the right is Peter Lawford, who's an actor and sometime member of the Hollywood Rat Pack with Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. et al. He was John F. Kennedy's brother-in-law at some point. He's the son of Major General Sidney Lawford, who's General Officer commanding 41st Division. That may well come up in a Great War Group quiz in the future. Who knows? So what's life actually like on the Italian front? I just referenced this. The picture in the background comes from a book called Our Italian Front by Martin Hardy and Warner Allen. And it's almost like a travelogue through the journey through the Italian front, just interspersed with a number of watercolours like that, which are pretty impressive. So it's a decent book to search out if you get the chance. It is the phrase "a different world" appears in a number of soldiers' memoirs about the Italian front. It is obviously a far quieter theatre than the Western Front, and a very different pace of life. The British and French contingent are defending the Montello and the Solo region, which I'll point out on a map in a moment or two, which kind of is a key point on the defence of the Piave River. The Italians have obviously only just retreated back there, so there's very little sign of war. It's not the sort of the shell-torn mudfest that the Western Front is. One of the key things is actually keeping the soldiers there occupied because it is much quieter. There is far less going on. The dumps, the curios, and the whatnots. They are the name of three concert parties of the divisions that were out there. And I managed to pull this picture, which I think is this fantastic picture of the 7th Division's concert party, and taken in September 1918. I'm sure it was all jolly japes and hugely entertaining to see this at the time, but probably shows what a different world we live in now. So the map, let's just see if I can get the pointy thing to work. So the British divisions, 23rd and 41st divisions, are here up on the Piave River, and the Montello, which is basically sort of a piece of high ground on the Allied bank of the Piave River. The French are next to them, just there in blue, and this whole front here, there's Asiago there. This is where we go up into the mountains, so to Monte Grappa, Monte Tomba, which I'll mention in a moment because that becomes quite a key point. And you'll see where the divisional reserves are. The 7th Division there, 48th and 5th Division, and that's broadly where they are at the end of the year. We include this. I think that the slide is probably self-explanatory. Wine, women, and frankly, a lot of venereal disease. What happens here broadly? British soldiers coming over are introduced to Italian wine, which frankly is rather somewhat stronger than they're used to. The Italian brothels, as such, do a roaring trade. Those young ladies, I'm told, are ladies of the night from Italy around about that time, and that's a poster about the enslaving habits of venereal disease, the incidence of which were far higher than on the Western Front. There is a serious point to this. As I said, there is a genuine concern in high command at the lack of active engagement. There's no home leave possible. You can't get home from Italy. So there's an awful lot of sporting pursuits taking place. You look at the war diaries, there are any number of football tournaments, there are shooting tournaments. You can go away. Rome's quite a popular destination for people on leave. They can jump on the train and be at Rome in a few hours. And it seems like the mood sort of tends to vary, but morale actually remains good throughout the campaign, which I think, given where the state of most armies are at that point in 1917, is actually quite a reasonable achievement. How the Brits or the British contingent view the Italian army is varied, to say the least. Robertson is kind of pretty disparaging about them, and he's far from alone. There's a point where Diaz actually thinks about dropping back further from the Piave River, but Plumer and Fayolle, who's replaced Duchesne as the commander-in-chief of the French contingent out there, dissuade him. Because the Piave is pretty much sort of sacred ground now that they've held, and they really don't need another sort of blow to morale or any more military difficulties. Plumer actually takes a bit more of a nuanced view of the Italians, having worked with them, and he's inspected them and dealt with their general staff on quite a bit. And he believes they're good soldiers, but they're poorly led and poorly trained, and they lack sort of basic knowledge of modern military tactics that have been developed on the Western Front. The artillery is notable in this. It's worth mentioning because it's particularly bad. There's just a real lack of cooperation with the infantry. Very little counter battery work, and as the Western Front over the course of sort of 15, 16, and 17 is illustrated, when the infantry don't trust the artillery, then they don't work together. Things don't generally tend to go well. Plumer kind of notes that the staff work is not brilliant. There's a sort of a bit of a habit to sort of change plans late on and not re-inform the right people. And he refers to their irksome habit of closing down between noon and 3 p.m. for lunch and a rest, which I can imagine probably would get on your nerves a little bit if you're trying to fight a war. Edward, Prince of Wales, is out there. He's on Cavern's staff as his ADC, I think. The next slide is a quote about him. There's an action at Montmeleta, which the Austrians capture on the 4th and 5th of December 17. They take 16,000 Italian prisoners in a relatively short space of time, and there's what's described as a disconcerting lack of resistance. What is so sickening is that no Huns took part in last week's attack on Mount Meleta. It was an entirely Austrian attack, and yet we felt confident the Italians were more than a match against them and only ran before purebred Huns. God only knows what will happen if the Huns attack up there. We are just praying for snow. So entirely complimentary about the Italian army. So we kind of move into 1918. The last knockings of 1917, the French actually have a good degree of success. They launched an attack on, or 47th Chasseur Division launches an attack on Monte Tomba in the Monte Grappa sector, and actually do pretty well. They kill over 500 Austro-Hungarians and take 1,500 prisoner. And it's kind of the first illustration that there can be attacks on this front. We're not just sitting here defensively. We can go forward and actually achieve something. At the same time, the Italians are kind of quite short on resources. Italian Prime Minister, I think is Orlando at that time, writes to David Lloyd George on the 23rd of December and noting they're basically just short of coal and sort of basic food stuff. And obviously shipping tonnage at that point is an issue with the German U-boat campaign. But overall, I think moving into 1918, it's important to note that front has calmed down. The Italians have settled. It's been useful to have the Brits, the British and the French there, to the point where there's a concern about what's going to happen in the spring on the Western Front, to the point where in February and March, Plumer returns home and goes back to Second Army. 41st and 5th Divisions leave him, along with 3 French divisions. And that basically leaves 7th, 23rd and 48th South Midland Divisions in Italy, where they remain for the rest of the war. That's just another slide, which I thought was a great picture of the French at Monte Tomba. And I think I'll touch on this towards the end, but some of the literature is there's very much a saviour complex about how we save the Italians. And I don't particularly think that's true, as I've indicated, but it's just interesting to see a lot of the literature of the time about how the British and the French were kind of this sort of white knights that rode to the Italians' aid. I'm going to kind of round off by talking about the key engagements of 1918 on the Italian front. I'm not going to go to masses of details about battles, because these are 2 battles which are interesting in their own right and probably could do with a far more sort of detailed presentation at some point in the future. Second Battle of the Piave River, which the Italians know as the Battle of the Solstice, which includes the Battle of the Asiago Plateau. That's June 1918. And then the end of the campaign is the Battle of Vittorio Veneto on this front, between the 24th of October and the 3rd of November 1918. Battle of Asiago, I talk about this a little bit more detail in my presentation on 48th South Midland Division, which I think is lurking around in the Great War archives and available on YouTube. You can see in red there's the British positions, 23rd and 48th Division. To their right, the 24 and the 23, that's the French. 12th is the Italians. Now, they're guarding the Asiago Plateau, which is basically one of the only routes out of the mountains for the Austro-Hungarian army, which could take them down onto the Venetian plain and could actually give them access to the Piave River from the rear, which would be particularly bad. And then that leads down onto sort of Venice and the Adriatic. So the British and the French at this point in June are actually planning their own attack when the Austro-Hungarians mount their own attack. It's described by James Edmonds in the official history as a battalion commanders and soldiers battle. You can read accounts of it in various from war diaries. There's quite a clear sort of degree of confusion about what's going on at the time. British forces are fairly well depleted by a flu bug, which has hit 48th and 23rd Divisions, so they're kind of limited in numbers. The Austro-Hungarians take a reasonable degree of ground, including a sort of key position at the Cesuna switch, hence its use in the title of this presentation. 48th Division suffered the biggest breakthrough. There's some incursion on 7th through 7th Division's line. The French managed to deter all the attackers with just artillery fire. Everything is repelled by about 9 a.m. the following morning. All the Austro-Hungarian attackers have been repelled and are being pursued back towards their own lines. What makes it notable is that Cavan actually dismisses the General Officer Commanding of 48th Division, Robert Fanshawe. And that's kind of, it's all comparative because there's not huge amounts of literature on it, but it forms an awful lot of discussion around this particular battle. There's a new book on 48th South Middle Division called A Brilliant Little Victory by a chap called Derek Plews, and he actually goes into it in considerable amount of detail. And it's worth reading if you are so interested. Another map. This is broadly the position in August. The Austro-Hungarians are clearly sort of starting to think about retiring. The war isn't going particularly well for them. And there are a series of raids during that time, which I'll talk about. And we can move back to the map if need be afterwards, if anyone wants to talk about in a little bit more detail. It's very apparent that the June action is the Austro-Hungarians. Really, it's the last throw of the dice. All the intelligence is pointing about they're very overstretched and reasonably close to collapse. Cavan is very, very keen to kind of push the advantage, but Diaz is a little reluctant. He thinks that the troops need to be sort of resupplied, reorganised, and have a bit more rest. Henry Wilson actually goes out to Italy with a view to trying to persuade him to do that because it's pissed Foch off enormously. Diaz quite clearly isn't interested, and Wilson doesn't really push the point. Wilson goes back and is really quite fulsome in his praise of Cavan as a commander, which pricks Lloyd George's ears up as to a possible Haig replacement, which he's been frantically searching around for but can't find. He gets overtaken by events. Amiens happens, I think, about a fortnight after he makes contact with Cavan, which basically ends any intrigue over Haig. As summer progresses, it's quite clear the Austro-Hungarian army are preparing to retreat to what's called the Winter Stellung, which is their winter line. And the raids that I mentioned during August, it's quite clear that the enemy is bailing out. So where does it? How do we bring the Italian front to? Or how do they bring the Italian front to an end? It's very clear that late summer that things are drawing. The war is coming to its closing stages. The Austrian government is fairly close to collapse. They're dealing with riots and demonstrations and food shortages of all sorts. Diaz is still fairly reluctant to attack, but what his government say to him is, look, there are Habsburg armies still on our soil. If we come to peace talks and that's still the case, that's going to be awkward, so we need them out. The Central Powers themselves, I think, are also sort of seeking an exit by this point. So Diaz actually agrees to make an attack under a sort of fair degree of pressure from his own government. And this leads us to the Battle of Vittorio Veneto, which is, as I say, the denouement of the campaign. Again, I'm not going to go into masses of detail. It's one of those battles I think is well worth a read about. The scale of it is really quite impressive. 57 Allied infantry divisions, 52 Italian, 3 British, 2 French, and the Americans join in as well. 10th Anglo-Italian Army under Cavan is 7th and 23rd Divisions of 14 Corps. And it's 2 units of the Italian 11th Corps. There are 7,700 Allied guns. And it broadly, this brings to end the war on the front. I think the Italians capture something like 450,000 Austro-Hungarian soldiers. And it's really where the empire starts to break down. Nikolai is probably a better man than I on this, but I think various sort of ethnic groups start to sort of break away from the empire itself. And it ultimately leads to the Padua Armistice of the 3rd of November 1918, which takes effect on the following day. I'm going to wrap up just with a few of my thoughts and conclusions that others have drawn and questions that arise. I mentioned this kind of saviour complex. In a lot of the literature, there's this kind of notion that the British and the French were sort of the white knights that rode to the Italians' aid, which I think it does the Italian army a disservice for all of the disasters of Caporetto. They do actually acquit themselves fairly well in defending that line of the Piave River. They are fighting a sort of very overstretched army, which has sort of massively overrun its lines. But it's still, nonetheless, I think, quite an impressive achievement on their part. Lloyd George and Haig, who was right? I think it's kind of an interesting question. I think Lloyd George, and I think any number of historians would probably agree, trying to knock off the Austro-Hungarian Empire out of the war by shifting troops down to the Italian front would have been a dramatic mistake. Logistically, a huge challenge, a very alien environment for most troops that have been on the Western Front, and it would have weakened the Western Front at exactly the wrong time. I do think he was right to insist on bolstering the Italians after Caporetto. There is a possibility the Italians could have sued for peace thereafter. Where does that leave the rest of its allies? Now, you potentially have the need for the French to protect their border with Italy against invasion. It potentially frees up an awful lot of Austro-Hungarian divisions. Would another 30 Austro-Hungarian divisions have made a difference in the spring offensive? It's crystal ball stuff, but I think you can broadly see where I'm going with it. Does it alter the course of the war? Maybe, maybe not, but I think it certainly would have given the Allies a lot to think about had things been different after Caporetto. That is broadly it from me. What I'll do is there's just a few pictures of I've taken on the Italian front over the years. As I said at the beginning, it's a fascinating front in genuinely beautiful countryside. Well worth going to see if it's something that you're thinking about. And that is that from me.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Jonny. That was really fascinating. Great talk. Lots packed in there and very thought-provoking. So I'm sure we will have some questions from among the group. So please do raise a hand or just unmute and ask away. Maybe just while people are thinking of something, can I ask, when you went to the Italian front, did you do an organised tour, or were you kind of self-guiding, just going around to sites?
Very much self-guided.
Your own initiative.
First, it came up. Most of you know Andrew Holmes, and we have a couple of other mates. We do a battlefield tour every year, and we've just done a lot, the Western Front quite a lot. So we thought, let's go somewhere else. So we just a bit of digging around. Obviously, you're limited to a couple of guidebooks and digging through war diaries, and we just pieced together a reasonable sort of dig around the Asiago Plateau. Obviously, we've learnt more over the years as time's gone on. But yeah, I think I've got a feeling Clive Harris's tour company, I think it's Battle Honours Tours, I'm not sure. I think he takes a tour out there occasionally. So there are tours available. But yeah, it's certainly a place worth visiting.
Yeah, great. And I think our Alex Churchill has got something planned for Historia as well, hasn't she?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, Historia, I've done it before. Yes, apologies. Yeah. That's definitely.
That's right. Well, we've got to plug that.
Not mentioning the boss as well. Yeah, no, she has, and I believe there's tours planned for the future.
Yeah. Great stuff. Anyone wanting to ask? There was a comment Jan put in the chat, which was kind of obviously linking back to when British troops were being sent out in larger numbers. And I think as you highlighted at the end there, really, the British Army didn't have a great deal of experience of the sort of terrain that they found themselves in, other than perhaps Northwest Frontier. But I suppose, do you know, I mean, was that kind of considered at the time to be any relevance for how they went about campaigning?
I don't think so. I think there's kind of a degree. When you actually see the terrain they're on, they didn't go a long way up the mountains. It has to be said. It's right. Kind of you get beyond the plateau, which is I think kind of 4,000 or 5,000 feet above sea level. They don't really go much beyond that, so it's not mountain warfare as you and I would know it. And if you look at kind of the actual White War, for want of a better phrase, it's a very different thing. So, and I think I didn't push it, but I think when you look at it tactically in terms of equipment and so on, it's got a far greater kind of resonance to the Western Front than anywhere else. Western Front, not Eastern Front, as we would note.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's interesting. And of course, there isn't a tradition in the British Army, is there, of alpine troops, specialist troops for that sort of terrain either. So
no, definitely not. Definitely not.
Okay, great. Steve, you have a question. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, just a question of logistics. I'm presuming that both the British and the French divisions went by French railways down to Italy. Was there any sort of cooperation logistically to perhaps, or did you just keep the supply chain separate?
Logistics is a really interesting thing. It's one of the things that I think is probably really underrepresented in the literature. Yeah, for the most part, I think it was via train, and it's that route that kind of runs through down to the Italian coast, and then it's the link across the Mediterranean down to sort of Egypt and so on. That's really about as much as I know about it, because it is, as I say, I think it's really underrepresented, and it's a really great example of where you've got sort of John Dillon's Allies or Tiresome Lots, probably the most comprehensive work on the subject, and I think he does touch upon it, but there's any number of things like the tactical approach to how they actually fight there. Logistics is certainly something, because it's a really fascinating thing. It's this sort of kind of mix. If you go there, you'll see mule tracks, and you'll see these sort of fantastic contraptions that they used to haul stuff up mountains, where there's still sort of kind of cable car gear there. So there's a real kind of mix between old and new. So yeah, broadly speaking, yes, I think that's it. It's the rail link down through France, and down into northern Italy, sort of kind of Genoa way, and then on from there. So yeah, you've identified a gap. Definitely something that needs a bit of further digging.
Thanks, Jonny.
Yeah. I've read an account, and forgive me because I haven't got the book here, so I can't check. But I think it's a soldier who was in 48th South Midland Division, British soldier, describing his time on the Western Front and then his time in Italy as well, which is very interesting. And certainly the journey he described by train down to the south of France, along the coast into Italy, seems to take a very, very long time. And then they get to a railhead, and then they are marching for days and days, as I recall, until they reach their final position. So I think the whole transfer takes something like 3 or 4 weeks. Now, I don't know whether that was typical of all of them, but it certainly suggests that it's a pretty slow process.
I think that applies to a number of them. I think one of the things at the time, there's a delay in actually sending a couple of the divisions, because the rail network is sort of overfilled, which shifting people towards Cambrai. So there's kind of a capacity thing. But yeah, going south, there is a good degree of marching that goes on from memory. There's a really good memoir by a chap called Hugh Dalton, who goes on to become the first Labour government's Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he serves with an artillery unit out there. And he goes before everyone else. He's one of the sort of the advance party that I talked about. And he refers to this sort of long rail journey through sort of the mountains and all the rest of it. I can't remember how I think he gets, there's motor transport, because they have guns with them as well. I think they have motor transport. But yeah, it's again just one of those underrepresented bits in the historiography that needs a bit more work.
Yeah. I'm just going to be a bit cheeky here and do another plug. And in fact, because somebody else who I think has a very interesting account is E.H. Shepard, who is best known, of course, as the illustrator of Winnie the Pooh and Wind in the Willows and so on. And in fact, at the museum where I'm a trustee, Soldiers of Oxfordshire, we've got a Shepard exhibition at the moment. And there are some lovely wartime sketches, both from Western Front and from his time in Italy, because he was an officer with the Royal Artillery. I think he ended up major commanding his battery. So he'd finished his war in Italy and was then essentially part of the sort of army forces trying to sort of rehabilitate the land and capturing, Austro or taking control of Austro-Hungarian equipment and so on. So there's some quite interesting things there. And I think there is an account that he's written of his time in Italy as well.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, if anyone's near Woodstock, then do pop into the museum there. Right, plug over. Bart, you've got an interesting question there, and nice to see you're wearing your Skoda T-shirt. And of course, Skoda provided most of the guns for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so that seems fairly appropriate.
I don't know. It actually means it's a family name in Czech, but it also means it's a pity. So Toye Skoda is it's a pity.
Ah, interesting.
I used to drive a Skoda, so that's unusual for an American. For you Brits, you've known them for years. Jonny, I don't know much about the 332nd, the U.S. Ohio Regiment that was there. I know when we were like the Second Corps, Jan brought up the 28th and 30th, 27th and 30th Divisions, Second Corps served on the Somme. They carried Smellies and SMLEs and used 303 for logistics versus American 30-06. Was the American regiment paired with an English division in Italy?
I don't think
our guys. I don't know.
Kind of in their own command. Again, there's just such a lack of kind of writing on the subject. I've obviously not also dug massively into it, but I've not found a great deal about what the Americans did there. I've got a feeling they were autonomous until possibly to the point where you get to Vittorio Veneto, where they come under. Oh goodness, I can't remember who they get grouped under. But yeah, sort of common sense suggests for logistics purposes, it probably would be. Or they probably would be using right.
Just bringing up another
common with others, yeah.
Yeah, another sets of boxes of ammunition just didn't make sense.
Yeah, so, good question. You know what? It's one of those subjects where I've obviously done some digging, but more will ensue, and I'll see what I can find out.
And I don't know if you just saw, Jan's just posted a comment, and he's saying, as far as he knows, the US regiment was part of 10th Army.
Okay.
So that's, and
in which case, yeah, I bow to that knowledge because I have to say I didn't do a huge amount of digging on the Americans because it is, for all intents and purposes, a relatively limited part of. But if they were on the 10th Army, excellent. Thank you for that.
Okay. And Nikolai, very helpfully, has just posted a photo of a book.
You knew he'd have a book.
Yeah, American Lions, the 332nd Infantry Regiment in Italy in World War One.
There you go.
By Robert and Rebecca D'Alessandro. So there we go. Nice one, Nikolai. There's always a book. There's always
a book. Yeah. Okay. That'd be just. I'll try and pick myself a copy.
What we'll do, in fact, to sort of wrap up to the whole course, I'll put together, with the help of all of our speakers, a book list, because there's been various books mentioned, and I said that I'd kind of let people know. So I'll send around the links to all of the recordings and include a book list as well for further reading for people who are interested in taking topics further. And yeah, I'm sure our speakers would be very happy to be contacted as well by people if they got particular things they want to find out. Excellent. I'll just check and see whether there's any other comments or questions arising. Actually, Jonots did post something about the huge number of Romanian prisoners in 1918, approximately 18,000 prisoners.
It's one of the things, I mean, obviously I mentioned the number of prisoners taken in Vittorio Veneto. I touch on it in the presentation I did about 48th South Midland Division, but they take they don't take part in the main part of Vittorio Veneto. They're up on the plateau and they push up through a valley, the Val d'Assa, and go towards the border with the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time. And they take an extraordinary number of prisoners. It's just, they're kind of, the Austro-Hungarian army is broadly given up at that point. They do make some resistance, but they take a ridiculous number of prisoners. I can't remember how many it is, and they cover a lot of distance as well. So yeah, I'd imagine dealing with the aftermath of that would be quite some task.
Excellent. Okay, well, I think we can draw to a close then. Let me